Frank was making his usual haul, a straight shot delivering furniture from his employer in Pittsburgh down to their store in Roanoke. But this time he was running a little behind schedule. Normally, he'd stick to the major highways, I-79 to 19, then east on over to Roanoke. He figured that would get him to Roanoke in good time. But tonight, there'd been an accident on the highway, some kind of pileup south of Morgantown, and traffic was at a standstill. After sitting in line for a good half hour, Frank pulled out his maps. A lot of drivers relied on GPS, but Frank preferred to do things old school. He always carried a big, laminated map of West Virginia and the surrounding states in his cab. He found an alternate route, one that cut through some back roads, weaving around through the mountains. It wasn't ideal, but it would get him to Roanoke without losing too much time. He'd have to go through a stretch near Parsons, then loop down through the Monongahela National Forest. He'd been that way a few times before, though it wasn't his favorite. Narrow roads, sharp curves, and not much traffic, especially at night. By the time Frank passed through Morgantown and got onto Route 72 heading to Parsons, it was already pushing midnight. The fog was starting to settle in, the kind of mist that hangs low over the road and makes everything just a little bit harder to see. Route 72 isn't a well-traveled road, especially late at night. It cuts through some of the most remote parts of West Virginia, where the trees press in close and the mountains rise up on either side like walls. You can go for miles without seeing another vehicle or any signs of life. Frank didn't mind the isolation, though. He'd been a trucker long enough that the quiet had become almost comforting. He liked the sound of the road, the hum of the engine, the way the world seemed to shrink down to just him and the cab when he was driving through the middle of nowhere. The road wound up and down, twisting through the foothills of the Alleghenies. He wasn't too worried about making time. He figured the detour would only add an hour or so to his trip. He had his CB radio on, though nobody was talking. It was one of those nights where everything just felt still. Around 1:30 a.m., Frank hit a stretch of road that ran alongside the Cheat River. The fog was thicker now, hanging over the water like a blanket, and the road was slick from the light rain that had been falling for the last hour. He slowed down a little, not wanting to take any chances on these narrow, winding roads. As he rounded a curve near a place called Horseshoe Run, he saw something out of the corner of his eye. At first, he thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. It's not uncommon to see them darting across the road at night. But this was different. It didn't move like a deer, and it was too big to be a bear. Frank slowed the truck even more, squinting through the fog to get a better look. Whatever it was standing on the side of the road, just outside the tree line. It wasn't moving, just standing there watching. Frank's headlights caught it for a brief moment, and in that second, he realized this wasn't like any animal he'd ever seen. It was tall, taller than a man, at least 7 or 8 feet. It had long, gangly limbs that seemed too long for its body, and its skin, or maybe fur, was dark and matted, almost blending in with the shadows of the trees. But the most striking thing were its eyes. They were glowing, reflecting the truck's headlights with an unnatural brightness, like 2 yellow orbs just hanging there in the dark. Frank felt a jolt of adrenaline shoot through him. He wasn't the kind of guy to scare easily. He'd been driving these roads for years and had seen all sorts of wildlife, weird weather, even the occasional ghost story pass between truckers at rest stops. But this was something else. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, its glowing eyes locked on his truck as he rolled past. For a second, Frank considered stopping, maybe to get a better look or to convince himself he wasn't seeing things. But something in his gut told him to keep moving. He'd learned over the years to trust his instincts, and right now, they were screaming at him to get the hell out of there. He eased the truck back up to speed, keeping an eye on the rearview mirror. As he drove away, he thought he saw the thing move, not fast, but deliberately, like it was stepping out of the shadows, back into the road. Frank's heart raced, and he kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see it following him. But the road behind him stayed empty. For a while, Frank drove in silence, his hands tight on the wheel, his eyes scanning the dark, foggy road ahead. He He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, like there was something out there in the woods watching him. He flicked on his high beams, but they didn't do much to cut through the fog. He reached the small town of Harmon a little after 2 a.m. It wasn't much more than a few houses and a gas station, but Frank decided to pull in and take a break. His hands were still shaking a little as he parked the truck. He sat there for a minute, staring out at the empty lot, trying to get his heart rate back to normal. Frank wasn't the type to believe in monsters or the paranormal. He figured there had to be some kind of explanation for what he'd seen. Maybe it was a bear with mange, or maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him in the fog. But deep down, he knew that wasn't it. He'd seen plenty of bears, and they didn't move like that, didn't have eyes that glowed like that. After a few minutes, he went into the gas station, grabbed a cup of coffee, and sat down at one of the booths near the window. There was an old-timer behind the counter, the kind of guy who'd probably lived in the town his whole life. Frank didn't say anything about what he'd seen. What was he supposed to say? Instead, he just made small talk, asked about the weather, the road conditions up ahead. The old man mentioned that the fog had been rolling in thick lately, said it wasn't uncommon this time of year. Frank nodded, though he wasn't really listening. His mind kept drifting back to that thing on the side of the road, those glowing eyes watching him as he drove past. Eventually, Frank finished his coffee, thanked the old man, and got back in his truck. He still had a couple of hours to go before he hit Roanoke, and he wasn't keen on sticking around longer than he had to. As he pulled out of the gas station and back onto the road, he couldn't help but glance in the mirrors again, half expecting to see those glowing eyes in the dark behind him. But the rest of the trip was uneventful. The fog lifted as he got farther south, and by the time he rolled into Roanoke around 5 a.m., the sun was just starting to rise. Frank was exhausted, more from the tension than the drive itself, but he finished his delivery and checked into a motel to get some rest. Even years later, Frank still thinks about that night. He's never told anyone the full story, not his fellow truckers, not his family. Every once in a while, when the conversation turns to strange things seen on the road, he'll mention the glowing eyes, just to see if anyone else has a story like his. But no one ever does. And Frank? He's not sure what he saw that night on Route 72. All he knows is that whatever it wasn't something he'd ever want to see again. Emily Cook and Lisa Van Arsdale had always been the type to chase the kind of adventures that took them away from suburbia. The two had met at a yoga class years ago and quickly bonded over their shared love for Michigan's wild spaces. They had hiked trails around the Lower Peninsula, but the Porcupine Mountains in the Upper Peninsula were a whole new level of wilderness. Rugged, remote, and untouched by modern life. It was a place where cell phone signals disappeared, and the only sounds might be the wind through trees, some of them older than the state itself. For weeks, they had been planning their escape into the deep woods. Neither of them imagined that something else might be out there with them. Emily had been there once before, but this would be Lisa's first time venturing so deep into the woods. They had picked the perfect season, early fall, when the air was crisp but not yet cold. The two friends arrived on a Friday afternoon, parking their car at the Lake of the Clouds trailhead. The view from the overlook was breathtaking. The lake, surrounded by thick forests, stretched out below them, with ridges of ancient rock rising up on either side. Their plan was to hike a loop that would take them deep into the forest, where they would camp for the night before heading back the next day. They had packed light but were prepared for a couple of days of roughing it. The first few hours were peaceful. The trail was well marked, winding through a mix of hardwoods and pine. The women chatted about work, upcoming plans, and the usual things friends talk about. Occasionally, they would stop to rest and look around. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of small animals. Every now and then, they would pass another hiker, but as they got deeper into the woods, the encounters became less frequent. By late afternoon, they had left the more popular parts of the park behind. The trail narrowed, and the trees seemed to grow closer together. It was then that Lisa, walking a few steps ahead of Emily, suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" she asked, turning to look at Emily. Emily listened but heard nothing unusual at first. "What did it sound like?" she asked. "I don't know. Like a thump, or something heavy moving or being dragged." They stood still for a moment listening, but the noise had stopped. Shrugging it off, they continued on, though Lisa couldn't get past what she had heard, or shake a strange feeling that had crept up on her. As dusk approached, they found a clearing off the trail where they planned to set up camp. It was a small, open area surrounded by trees, with enough space for their tent and a small fire. They set to work quickly, knowing they had only a short time before dark. As Lisa worked on pitching the tent, Emily gathered some fallen branches for a fire. She moved about 50 feet from the campsite, scanning the ground for dry wood, when she saw something that made her have to catch her breath. At first, she thought it was a large footprint in the soft ground, but it wasn't exactly normal. It was huge, easily twice the size of her own, and the shape was different too. It was broader, with toes splayed out in a way that didn't look human. She crouched down, running her fingers lightly over the edge of the print, feeling the indentation in the earth. It seemed fresh. "Hey Lisa, come look at this," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. Lisa came over and knelt beside her, eyes widening as she saw the print. "What the hell?" she muttered, glancing around as if expecting to see the creature that had left it standing nearby. "That's not a bear print, is it?" Emily shook her head. She had seen bear tracks before, and this wasn't one of them. Bears had claws, and their tracks were more rounded. This track was different, larger, and almost human-like, but too big to be a person's. They both stared at the print for a moment before Lisa stood up and brushed her hands on her jeans. "Let's not freak ourselves out," she said, but Emily could tell from her voice that she was unnerved. "We'll just keep the fire going all night. Nothing's coming near us if we have a fire." Emily nodded, but she wasn't totally convinced they'd be okay. As they finished setting up camp, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest around them grew darker. The fire crackled and popped as it took hold, casting light around the clearing. They sat close to the fire, their earlier lightheartedness replaced by a quiet tension. It was sometime later that they heard it. An ominous and deep sound echoed through the trees, something like a growl but deeper and more resonant. Both women looked slowly around the campsite. The sound came again. "What is it?" Lisa whispered, her voice tight with fear. Emily shook her head. "I don't know," she whispered back. They both stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, straining their eyes to see what was out there. But the trees loomed like black silhouettes, giving nothing away. The sound came again, followed by a crashing noise, like something large moving through the underbrush. They sat motionless, the fire crackling between them and the dark forest. They were literally just waiting for something to emerge. But after a few tense minutes, the noise stopped, and the forest went silent again. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. "I think we should stay up for a while," Lisa said quietly, her eyes still fixed on the trees. Emily nodded in agreement. She felt that was an obvious choice, to say the least. There was no way either of them was going to sleep now. For the next few hours, they stayed close to the fire, jumping at every little noise. But nothing else happened. The strange sounds didn't return, and the night passed without further incident. In the morning, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, and the forest seemed peaceful again, as if the strange noises of the night had never happened. However, they packed up camp quickly, both eager to get back to the trailhead and put some distance between them and whatever had been out there. As they hiked back, they didn't talk much. Both women kept glancing over their shoulders, as if expecting to see something following them. The huge footprint still seared in their head. When they finally reached the car, they threw their packs in the trunk and got in, slamming the doors behind them with a sense of relief. "I don't know what that was," Lisa said as they pulled out of the parking lot, "but I'm not coming back here anytime soon." Emily nodded in agreement, still thinking about the giant footprint they had seen. Whatever it was, they didn't want to find out. As they drove away, the dense forest of the Porcupine Mountains faded into the distance. leaving them with a story they weren't sure anyone would believe. But they knew what they had heard, and it wasn't something either of them would forget anytime soon. Jake had always been an outdoorsman, not in the way people talk about liking nature, but rarely leave the city. No, he lived for the wilderness, especially the kind of solitude that most people avoided. He'd heard of Amethyst Basin in the Uinta Mountains of Utah through a friend, who'd mentioned it as the perfect spot for a long, quiet getaway. It was far enough out that you wouldn't see another soul for days if you went at the right time. The terrain was rugged, the weather unpredictable, but Jake was drawn to it. He liked pushing his limits. Jake left early on a Friday morning, the drive from Salt Lake City taking him through smaller towns and miles of open road, each mile feeling like a step deeper into nowhere. By the time he reached the trailhead, the sun was already climbing high. He parked his truck and shouldered his gear, eager to cover ground before nightfall. The trail began gently enough, winding through thick stands of pine and aspen. After a few hours of steady hiking, the trail grew steeper, the trees denser, and the air cooler. He pushed forward, enjoying the challenge. As the afternoon wore on, he reached Amethyst Basin, a high-altitude lake surrounded by towering mountains. The place was just as remote as he'd hoped, the water calm and glassy under the afternoon sun. There wasn't another camper in sight. Jake set up his tent on a small ridge above the lake, then gathered wood for a fire. The air was already growing cold as the sun dipped behind the mountains, but the stars started to come out in full force, reflecting in the lake below. It was beautiful, and for a while, he sat by the fire, eating his simple meal and enjoying the quiet. But as the night wore on, that peaceful quiet began to shift. The woods around him seemed to close in. The sounds of animals scurrying through the underbrush disappeared, and a heavy stillness settled over the camp. Jake, normally unfazed by being alone in the wilderness, found himself feeling uneasy. The first noise came late, just as he was about to drift off to sleep. A sharp snap, like a branch breaking, echoed through the trees near his tent. His eyes shot open, and for a moment, he lay still, listening. Silence. Then another sound, this one closer, like something stepping slowly through the forest. Jake sat up, heart pounding. He strained his ears, but the noise had stopped. He chalked it up to a deer or some other animal. Nothing out of the ordinary for these mountains. But then he heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the forest floor. Not the random scampering of a wild animal, but something moving with purpose. He grabbed his flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent, peering outside. The beam cut through the darkness, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. Nothing was out there, but the air felt thick with tension. As Jake sat back inside the tent, trying to calm his nerves, something strange happened. His phone, which had no signal for hours, buzzed with a notification. Frowning, he pulled it out. A single text message blinked on the screen. "Get out." His stomach dropped. Jake wasn't one to scare easily, but this felt wrong. The phone had been on airplane mode, with no reception this far out. The message had no sender, no timestamp, just those two words. He shook his head, trying to brush off the fear creeping up his spine. It had to be some weird glitch. Maybe it was an old message that got delayed and finally pushed through. He turned the phone off entirely, tossed it back into his pack, and told himself to relax. But the footsteps started again, this time closer, almost right outside his tent. Jake shot up, adrenaline surging, and unzipped the tent in one quick motion. His flashlight beam swept over the trees, the fire's dying embers casting long shadows. Still nothing. Then, from the corner of his eye, he caught movement. Just beyond the firelight, near the edge of the forest, something moved swiftly between the trees, too fast to catch, but enough to set his nerves on edge. He pointed the flashlight in that direction, but it was gone. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. He sat by the fire, feeding it more wood and staying alert, the unease gnawing at him. Something was out there. It wasn't an animal. It felt like someone, or something, was watching him. The next day passed uneventfully. The sun was out, the lake was still, and Jake tried to shake off what had happened the night before. He explored the area, fished a little, and hiked a few miles to clear his head. As the day wore on, the eerie feeling faded a little, but a sense of dread lingered in the back of his mind. That night, he decided to keep the fire going for as long as possible. As the darkness settled in, he sat close to the flames, staring into the woods, waiting for something to happen. He didn't have to wait long. Around midnight, the footsteps returned, but this time they weren't slow and methodical. They were faster, moving in an erratic pattern, coming from different directions, as if multiple things were circling his camp. Jake stood up, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, turning in slow circles as he tried to track the sound. Then, out of nowhere, something darted across the edge of the firelight, fast, low to the ground. His heart raced. He pointed the light in that direction, but whatever it was had disappeared again. Then another movement behind him. Jake spun around, but it was gone before he could catch a proper glimpse. Suddenly, he heard the unmistakable sound of breathing, heavy, labored, just beyond the firelight. He froze, pointing the flashlight toward the noise, and what he saw made his blood run cold. At first, it looked like a person, a tall figure, standing unnaturally still, just beyond the light's reach. But the longer he looked, the more he realized something was wrong. Its body was twisted, like it had been broken and bent back together in a way that no human could survive. Its eyes, faintly glowing in the dark, locked onto Jake. Without thinking, Jake backed toward his tent, never taking his eyes off the figure. As he did, the thing took a slow, deliberate step forward, and a low, guttural growl echoed from its chest. Jake fumbled with his gear, grabbing his backpack and throwing it over his shoulder, all while keeping his knife pointed in the creature's direction. He wasn't staying another night. Forget the plan. Forget the peaceful solitude. This was no ordinary predator. He started down the trail, moving quickly but cautiously. The sound of footsteps, multiple now, following him. Every time he glanced back, he saw them. Tall, twisted shapes moving in the darkness, always just out of clear sight. Jake hiked through the night, not stopping until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. By the time he reached his truck, his body was trembling from exhaustion, but the sense of dread hadn't left him. As he started the engine, he glanced back at the trailhead one last time, but the trail was empty. Still, he kept thinking that whatever was there wasn't done with him. As he drove away, his phone, which he had left turned off, buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, heart pounding. Another message had appeared. This time it said, "We'll be waiting." He peeled out of the area like a bat out of hell and never went back. He still wonders about that night and how it all even happened. He has no explanation and no closure. Can any one of you guys help him move on from this? All right, imagine it's midday, and there's this bustling spot near the Aztec ruins. It's a mix of tourists and locals, some wandering around, snapping pictures, others just taking in the history of the place. The sun's high, casting strong shadows against the ruins. Out of nowhere, people start to notice something unusual in the sky. A figure coming down fast, almost like it's falling. At first, it looks like some kind of bird, but as it gets closer, people see it's much, much larger. Then, with a sudden jolt, it lands right on the edge of the crowd. Everyone backs up, speechless. Standing before them is a creature that looks almost human, with a body so thin and bony you can see every rib. Its skin this strange bronze color that glints in the sun. But it's those wings that really grab attention. Huge, feathery, almost angel-like, but clearly worn and damaged. Its face is the strangest of all. No whites in its eyes, just deep, empty blackness. It stands there swaying, its wings drooping down, and people aren't sure if it's even alive. Some are snapping pictures, others just staring, completely stunned. It takes a shaky breath, as if it's struggling just to stay upright. Everyone around can see it's hurt badly, too weak to do much of anything. For a while it seems like that's it. It's just going to collapse. But then slowly, it starts moving those massive wings. With a bit of struggle, it lifts its head and looks around, like it's sizing up the crowd. And then, in a single powerful burst, it pushes off the ground, wings beating hard, and lifts itself into the sky. The crowd watches in awe as it flies away, eventually disappearing over the ruins, leaving everyone there in stunned silence. People talk about it for the rest of the day, some saying it was an angel, others calling it a spirit or some ancient being from the Aztec legends. But no one's quite sure what they saw, only that they'll never forget it. James E. Tedford was a quiet, unassuming man who lived a simple life. He was a World War II veteran and was 68 years old in 1949. He had settled into a routine that suited him well. After the war, he and his wife lived in Franklin, Vermont, but life took a strange turn when his wife, Pearl, disappeared. No one knew what happened to her. James returned home one day, and she was simply gone. Her clothes and personal belongings were still in the house, but she had vanished without a trace. This was the first odd event in what would become an even more bizarre series of events. After Pearl's disappearance, James moved into a retirement home for veterans in Bennington, Vermont. He didn't seem overly upset about Pearl's disappearance, or if he was, he kept it to himself. Maybe he thought she had left him, or maybe he just didn't want to talk about it. In any case, James was a reserved man who mostly kept to himself. On December 1st, 1949, exactly 3 years after Paula Welden's disappearance, James Tedford also vanished under mysterious circumstances. His case, however, was even stranger. James had been visiting relatives in St. Albans, Vermont, and was returning to Bennington by bus. He boarded the bus, ticket in hand, and took his seat for the long ride back. Several witnesses saw him on the bus, and nothing seemed unusual. He was just an elderly man on a quiet bus ride through the rural backroads of Vermont. The bus route from St. Albans to Bennington was a well-traveled one, winding through small towns and the forested hills that surround the region. It was late afternoon, and as the bus rolled along, passengers chatted or dozed off. James sat quietly, gazing out the window. As the bus approached Bennington, it made several stops along the way, and each time, James was still there, sitting in his seat. But when the bus finally arrived in Bennington, James Tedford was gone. His luggage was still in the overhead rack, his bus ticket was on the seat, and his personal items were untouched. There was no sign of struggle, no indication that anything out of the ordinary had happened. It was as if James had simply vanished into thin air while the bus was moving. The bus driver and the other passengers were baffled. Several of them remembered seeing him just a few stops earlier, and no one recalled him getting off the bus. In fact, witnesses claimed he was still in his seat after the last stop before Bennington, which made his disappearance all the more perplexing. How could an elderly man just disappear from a moving bus without anyone noticing? Authorities were called, and an investigation began, but there were no leads. The bus had been on a straightforward route, with no unusual stops or detours. The driver and passengers were questioned multiple times, but no one could provide any answers. James Tedford had simply vanished while en route to his destination. One theory suggested that Tedford might have wandered off the bus unnoticed during one of the stops, but this seemed unlikely. He was elderly and not in the best of health. If he had gotten off, someone surely would have seen him. And even if he had, where would he have gone? There were no reports of anyone matching his description in any of the small towns the bus had passed through. Another theory, more popular among locals, was that something supernatural was at play. This was the third mysterious disappearance in the Bennington area in just 4 years. First, there was Mitty Rivers, an experienced hunter who vanished in 1945. Then, Paula Welden disappeared in 1946 while hiking on the Long Trail. Now, James Tedford had gone missing under even more bizarre circumstances. People in Bennington were starting to wonder if the area itself was cursed. Over the years, the idea of the Bennington Triangle began to take hold, fueled by these disappearances and the strange nature of the cases. Tedford's case, in particular, captured people's imaginations. How does someone vanish from a moving bus? Was he taken by someone or something along the way? Was there a rational explanation that no one had thought of? The search for Tedford didn't last long. There were no clues, no evidence to follow. His disappearance was added to the growing list of strange events in the area, but like the others, it remained unsolved. His relatives in St. Albans were just as confused as everyone else. Tedford had been in good spirits when he left their home, looking forward to returning to his quiet life in Bennington. There was no reason for him to simply walk away. The mystery of James Tedford's disappearance became a local legend, often retold in hushed tones around campfires or in diners. Some people speculated that the disappearances in the Bennington Triangle were linked to the area's history, which included strange occurrences dating back to the Native Americans who once inhabited the region. Others believed there might be a natural explanation, like an undiscovered cave system or some kind of geographical anomaly. There were even those who thought Tedford's disappearance might have been connected to his wife's earlier vanishing. After all, it was odd that both James and Pearl had gone missing under unusual circumstances just a few years apart. But without any evidence, these ideas remain speculative. In the decades since James Tedford's disappearance, no new leads have emerged. His case, like so many others in the Bennington Triangle, remains a cold mystery. Despite advances in technology and investigative techniques, there's still no explanation for what happened to him that day on the bus. Today, the story of James E. Tedford is one of the most famous disappearances in Vermont history, often mentioned alongside other strange vanishings in the Bennington Triangle. His name, like those of Paula Welden and Mitty Rivers, has become part of local folklore, a reminder of the unexplained mysteries that still haunt the forests and back roads of rural Vermont. As the years go by, the details of Tedford's life and disappearance have blurred into legend, but the basic facts remain. An elderly man boarded a bus one cold December afternoon, heading home to Bennington, and was never seen again. No one knows where he went, how he vanished, or why, and that mystery continues to captivate those who hear his story. Officer Mark Whitfield had been with the Washington State Police Department for nearly 15 years. He was used to working the night shifts, patrolling the rural highways and back roads that crisscrossed the Olympic Peninsula. It wasn't a glamorous job, but he liked the quietness of the woods and the solitude of driving through the deep, dark forests that stretched out on either side of the roads. However, there was one stretch of Route 112 near Clallam Bay that always made him feel uneasy. It wasn't a place that scared him exactly, more like it had a heavy atmosphere, the kind of spot that makes you glance in the rearview mirror just to check what might be there. It was early October, and the Pacific Northwest had just begun to settle into its rainy season. Thick, low-hanging clouds turned the daylight into a dull gray, and by 6 p.m., darkness had already started to creep in. Officer Whitfield had just completed a routine traffic stop on the main highway when a call came in over the radio. A truck driver reported something strange on a narrow, forested back road. The voice on the radio was calm, but had an edge of nervousness that caught Whitfield's attention. The driver had said something about a large animal running across the road in front of his vehicle. It wasn't an uncommon report for this area. There were plenty of bears, elk, and other wildlife around. But the dispatcher's tone suggested this was different. Whitfield took the call, responding with his usual dry, "Copy that, en route." He flipped on his patrol car's lights and turned onto the side road the trucker had mentioned. The rain had started to pick up, pattering against the windshield and blurring the world outside. He squinted into the darkness, the beams from his headlights cutting through the mist that clung to the dense pine forest lining the road. He reached the spot the trucker had indicated and slowed the car to a crawl. It was a narrow, winding road, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass. On either side, towering trees and underbrush closed in, leaving little room for anything large to move without being seen. Whitfield pulled over to the shoulder, the crunch of gravel under the tires barely audible over the sound of the rain. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out, scanning the area. There were no immediate signs of an animal crossing, no tracks in the muddy earth at the edge of the road. The air smelled of wet pine and earth, nothing unusual. He moved a few feet into the trees, sweeping his flashlight across the undergrowth when he saw it, a faint trail of broken branches and flattened ferns, leading deeper into the woods. Whitfield hesitated. It wasn't standard protocol to go chasing after animals in the middle of the night, especially in the thick forests where visibility was almost zero. But curiosity got the better of him. The trucker had seemed genuinely shaken, and that was enough to make him want to take a closer look. He followed the trail cautiously, stepping over roots and ducking under low branches. The beam of his flashlight bounced off the wet leaves, creating shifting shadows that made it hard to focus on anything for too long. He'd gone about 20 yards into the forest when he heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl but deeper, more resonant. It came from somewhere ahead, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. Whitfield stopped, his hand moving instinctively to the side of his belt, where his service weapon was holstered. He stood still, listening, but the sound didn't repeat. Instead, there was a rustling noise, followed by the distinct crack of a branch snapping. Slowly, he lifted his flashlight, aiming it toward the noise. For a moment, the light caught on something, a shape partially hidden by the dense foliage. His first thought was that it was a bear, but something about its silhouette was wrong. It was hunched over, with a long, low body and limbs that didn't quite seem to fit. The creature shifted slightly, and Whitfield caught a glimpse of its head. His stomach tightened. The eyes were what struck him first. Large, too large, reflecting the flashlight's beam with an eerie, almost reddish glow. Whitfield couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. The head was elongated, almost canine, but the body was all wrong. It looked as though someone had pieced together parts of different animals. The creature was still for a moment, then began to move, slinking backward into the shadows in a way that was terrifying. In a few seconds, it had vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only the rustling of disturbed branches. Whitfield backed away, keeping his flashlight trained on the spot where the creature had disappeared. His mind raced, trying to identify what he'd seen. A bear with mange? An injured wolf? None of those explanations fit. He reached the edge of the road and quickly got back into his patrol car, locking the doors out of an instinctual fear he hadn't felt in years. Sitting there, hands gripping the steering wheel, he realized he was holding his breath. Slowly, he exhaled, shaking his head as if to clear it. He grabbed the radio and reported back to dispatch. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I've checked the area. There's something out here. Can't confirm what it is. No immediate danger to the public, but it's definitely not normal wildlife." The radio crackled as the dispatcher responded. "Copy that, Unit 12. Return to base. We'll make a note of the sighting and pass it to Fish and Wildlife." "Roger that," Whitfield replied, already turning the car around to head back to the highway. As he drove away, he kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature darting across the road behind him. But there was nothing, just the blur of rain and trees. Over the next few days, he shared the encounter with a few fellow officers. Most nodded, listening with polite skepticism, chalking it up to a trick of the light, the stress of night shifts, or even a bear with an odd gait. But a couple of the older officers exchanged glances, their expressions tightening. Later, one of them pulled Whitfield aside and quietly mentioned that strange sightings had been reported in that area before, going back decades. "The woods here," the older officer said, "aren't like other places. Some things just don't want to be found." Whitfield never went back to that road without feeling a knot in his stomach. He continued his patrols, continued answering calls and doing his job, but that night stayed with him. Every time he drove through the forest around Clallam Bay, he felt a prickling at the back of his neck, a sense that the woods held secrets he would rather not uncover. Paula Welden was like any other college student, full of energy and curiosity about life. She was 18, a sophomore at Bennington College in Vermont, and always looking for a little adventure. On Sunday, December 1st, 1946, she decided to take a break from studying for her exams and head out for a hike on the long trail. It was a cold but clear day, and she was eager to get out and stretch her legs after spending so much time indoors. Paula wasn't much of an outdoors expert, but she'd done a bit of hiking before and figured the long trail would be a nice way to clear her head. It was a popular spot, well marked, and just a short distance from campus. She told her roommate and a few friends that she was going for a hike, but she didn't give any specific details about when she'd be back. This wasn't unusual. Paula was independent, confident, and known to be a bit spontaneous. She didn't always stick to rigid plans. She had invited them to join her, but they were all busy with classes and homework that day. That afternoon, she left her dorm wearing a coat, jeans, and light sneakers, with no additional gear. The outfit wasn't exactly ideal for a long hike in December, but Paula wasn't planning to be gone for very long. She wasn't carrying much with her. No map, no supplies, and certainly no heavy winter gear. It was just a quick, casual walk, or so she thought. Paula hitchhiked to the trailhead, which was only a few miles away. A local man named Louis Knapp gave her a ride and dropped her off near Bickford Hollow, an entrance to the Long Trail. It was around 2:30 p.m. when she started her hike, and everything seemed perfectly normal. Knapp later said she seemed happy, and nothing about her behavior raised any red flags. Other people saw her that day too. A group of older hikers recalled passing Paula as she walked along the trail, heading deeper into the woods. They remembered her red coat. It was hard to miss against the stark, wintry landscape. They didn't chat with her, but she smiled and nodded as they passed. She didn't seem lost or distressed. She was just another person out enjoying the day. But that would be the last time anyone ever saw Paula Welden. When she didn't return to campus that night, no one thought too much of it at first. Paula was known for her adventurous spirit, and it wasn't unusual for students to stay out late or change plans without letting people know. But as the night stretched on and the next morning came without any sign of her, her friends started to worry. They reached out to the school, and by the afternoon, the authorities were alerted. A search was quickly organized. Police, volunteers, and even Paula's parents came to Bennington to help. Paula's father, William Archibald Welden, was particularly distraught. He and his wife had dropped their daughter off at college just months earlier, and now she was missing in the wilderness. The search focused on the area around Bickford Hollow, where Paula had been dropped off, and the nearby portions of the Long Trail. At first, searchers were hopeful. After all, how far could she have gone? It was broad daylight when she started her hike, and the trail was well traveled. But as the hours ticked by and darkness fell, their optimism began to fade. The weather was turning colder, and Paula wasn't dressed for a long night outdoors. They combed through the forest calling her name, hoping to spot her red coat against the snowy trees. But there was nothing. The search stretched into the next day, and then the next. Day after day, volunteers and law enforcement scoured the area, but not a single clue turned up. Paula had vanished without a trace. As word of her disappearance spread, more people came to help, including experienced woodsmen and state police. They brought dogs, hoping they could pick up her scent, but the dogs couldn't find a trail to follow. It was as if she had just disappeared into thin air. Paula's father was devastated. He threw himself into the search, even going as far as to hire private detectives. He couldn't understand how his daughter, a healthy, smart young woman, could just vanish on a popular trail so close to town. The lack of any physical evidence was especially troubling. There were no footprints, no pieces of clothing, no broken branches, nothing. The case soon drew national attention, and the media swarmed Bennington. The more people heard about the case, the more theories started to swirl. Some thought Paula had simply gotten lost, maybe wandered off the trail and succumbed to the elements. Others thought she might have slipped into a ravine or fallen into a river. But without any evidence, these ideas were just guesses. Rumors also started to circulate, as they often do in these kinds of cases. Some speculated that Paula had run away, that maybe she'd decided to start a new life somewhere else. Others whispered about foul play, suggesting she'd been abducted or met with some kind of violence. One theory involved a mysterious man who had been spotted lurking in the area around the time Paula disappeared, but no solid leads ever came from that. Months passed, and the search eventually scaled back. Paula's family was heartbroken, but they continued to hold out hope that she would be found. Archibald Welden remained in Bennington for weeks, personally overseeing the search and speaking to anyone who might have information. But despite his efforts, no answers came. By spring, the case had grown cold. The woods, which had been blanketed in snow when Paula disappeared, began to thaw, and searchers hoped that the melting snow might reveal some clue, but nothing surfaced. Paula was gone, and no one could explain how or why. As the years went on, Paula's disappearance became one of Vermont's most infamous unsolved cases. It was the second mysterious disappearance in the Bennington Triangle, and it wouldn't be the last. Over the next few years, several more people would vanish in the same area, leading many to believe that something strange, maybe even supernatural, was at play. The locals, who had long whispered about the strange happenings in Glastonbury Mountain, felt their suspicions were confirmed. The area had a dark, eerie history, and Paula's disappearance only added to the mystery. Her case remains unsolved to this day. There are no answers, no closure for her family, and no way to explain what happened that cold December afternoon in 1946. Paula Jean Welden walked into the woods and never came back, leaving behind nothing but questions that continue to haunt the town of Bennington and everyone who hears her story. Mitch had never been one for hunting, but when his buddy Aaron invited him to tag along to Palmyra, Maine, he figured it couldn't hurt. Aaron was obsessed with tracking deer, and Mitch liked being outside. Besides, Aaron swore the woods were practically untouched there. They headed out on a Saturday morning in mid-November, the kind of crisp day where frost still clung to the ground, even after the sun was up. Aaron handed Mitch a spare pair of binoculars and a thermos of coffee before they started trekking into the woods. "We'll go deep," Aaron said, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "Deer don't hang out near the trailheads." That was fine by Mitch. He wasn't interested in shooting anything, but he didn't mind the walk. They trudged through the underbrush, the crunch of dead leaves and frost under their boots the only sound. By the time the sun was past its peak, Aaron decided to split up. "We'll cover more ground this way," he said. "Just head east for an hour or so. If you don't see anything, circle back." Mitch wasn't thrilled about wandering off alone, but Aaron was already disappearing through the trees. He sighed and started east. The woods were dense, darker than he expected now that the sun had dipped lower in the sky. The air smelled sharp, like wet bark and decay. Mitch kept his hands in his pockets, trudging through patches of frost. Then he noticed something odd. The birdsong stopped. It wasn't just quieter, it was totally silent. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Mitch paused and glanced around, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but the stillness was unnerving. He shook it off, figuring Aaron had spooked something nearby, and kept walking. About 10 minutes later, he found tracks in the frost. At first, he thought they were deer prints, but as he crouched down, he realized they were wrong. Too big and too deep, like they belonged to something heavier. His stomach knotted as he studied them. They looked like wolf tracks, but that didn't make sense. Wolves hadn't been common in Maine for decades. Mitch stood and scanned the woods again. This time, he saw movement, a flash of gray fur darting between the trees about 50 yards away. His pulse quickened. Maybe it was a coyote, but coyotes didn't get that big. He backed away slowly, trying to keep his breathing steady. The last thing he wanted was to startle it if it was still watching. As he turned to head back toward the trail, he heard a sound behind him, a growl. Mitch froze. It was low and rumbling, coming from somewhere just beyond the tree line. He turned slowly, gripping his binoculars like they might be a weapon. His eyes searched the shadows, but he didn't see anything at first. Then the growl came again, louder this time, and he caught a glimpse of eyes reflecting the dim light. They were closer than he'd thought. Mitch's stomach flipped. He took a shaky step backward, then another. He didn't know much about wolves, but he knew running was a bad idea. So he kept backing up, hoping it would stay where it was. Then he saw the second set of eyes. They were to his right, farther out but moving closer. He nearly lost it when he realized there was more than one. A third set appeared behind the second. This wasn't a random encounter. They were circling him. Panic surged through Mitch, but he forced himself to stay calm. He pulled out his phone, fumbling to unlock it. Maybe he could call Aaron, but what would he say? "Hey, I'm being stalked by wolves. Can you shoot them?" It sounded ridiculous even in his head. Before he could dial, his phone buzzed. A text from Aaron. "Where are you? Thought I saw something west of the trail." Mitch stared at the message, the absurdity of it almost making him laugh. He didn't have time to text back. The growling was getting louder. Then the snap of a branch made him spin around. A wolf stepped out of the trees, its coat dark and mottled with patches of gray. It wasn't huge, not like the stories claimed, but it was big enough. Its head was low, ears pinned back, and its teeth bared in a silent snarl. Mitch held his ground, his brain racing for what to do. Yelling might scare it off, but what if it didn't? He glanced around for something he could use as a weapon, but the forest floor was bare. The wolf took a step closer. Then another sound came, a sharp, high-pitched whistle. The wolf froze, its ears twitching. Mitch's breath caught in his throat as the whistle came again, this time from deeper in the woods. It was rhythmic, almost like someone calling a dog. The wolf turned, its head cocked toward the sound. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it slinked back into the trees. Mitch didn't wait to find out what was coming next. He bolted, crashing through the underbrush as fast as he could manage without tripping. He didn't care about staying quiet anymore. He just needed to get back to the truck. When he finally broke through the tree line, Aaron was waiting for him, rifle in hand. "Dude, what happened? You look like you saw a ghost." "Not a ghost," Mitch panted. "Wolves." Aaron frowned. "Wolves? Are you serious?" Mitch didn't answer. He glanced back at the woods, half expecting to see those eyes watching from the shadows. But there was nothing. "Let's go," he said finally, climbing into the truck. Aaron didn't argue. As they drove off, Mitch couldn't shake the feeling that the whistle wasn't random. Someone, or something, had called those wolves away. And whatever it was, he wasn't sure he wanted to meet it. It was Sam's first time in the piney woods of East Texas. He'd heard about Caddo Lake from a friend who raved about its eerie beauty. Spanish moss hanging from ancient cypress trees. Water so still it felt like glass. It was a far cry from the Rocky Mountain trails he was used to hiking. He'd come here for something different, and he sure got it. The plan was simple: paddle a kayak along one of the more remote trails, and camp by the water overnight. The weather was perfect for it, cool but not cold. The kind of evening where you could enjoy a campfire without freezing once it went out. He'd rented the kayak from a shop in Jefferson, where the old-timer at the counter gave him a strange look when he mentioned his route. "You're heading to Devil's Elbow?" the man asked, his voice almost a drawl. "That's what the map says," Sam replied, brushing it off. The man didn't press but handed over the paddle with a muttered, "Stay out of the trees after dark." Sam didn't think much of it at the time. Locals loved their spooky stories, and he assumed this was just another one. Still, the name Devil's Elbow stuck in his head as he launched the kayak into the water that afternoon. The paddle through the cypress maze was beautiful, just as his friend had described. The trees rose like sentinels out of the dark water, their reflections rippling with every stroke of his paddle. It was peaceful in a way he hadn't expected, even with the occasional rustle of unseen creatures in the brush. By the time he reached the small clearing where he planned to set up camp, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. He pulled the kayak ashore, pitched his tent, and got a small fire going. As the sky darkened, The forest around him came alive with the sounds of frogs and crickets. He sat by the fire, eating a granola bar and listening to the night. The occasional splash of fish breaking the surface made him glance toward the water, but nothing seemed out of place. Then the noises stopped. It was so abrupt that Sam noticed immediately. One moment, the forest was a symphony of sound. The next, it was silent. Even the frogs had gone quiet. Sam froze, his granola bar halfway to his mouth. He scanned the waterline, the trees, the dark spaces beyond the reach of his firelight. Nothing moved, but the stillness felt wrong. He told himself it was just his imagination, the kind of unease that comes when you're alone in the wilderness. He tossed the rest of the granola bar into the fire and stood to stretch. That's when he saw it, a shadow moving between the trees across the water. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the firelight, but then it moved again, deliberate and slow. Whatever it was tall, much taller than a person. Sam grabbed his flashlight and aimed it across the water. Nothing. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating only trees and tangled vines. Sam let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He turned back toward his tent, laughing at himself under his breath. The laugh died in his throat when he heard the splash. It wasn't the small splash of a fish, but the deep, deliberate sound of something large entering the water. He spun around, his flashlight sweeping the lake. The beam caught ripples spreading outward from the trees, but whatever had made them was gone. His heart pounded as he scanned the water, the trees, the shadows that seemed to move even when he wasn't looking. The splash came again, closer this time. Sam's grip on the flashlight tightened as he aimed it toward the noise. That's when he saw it. A figure was rising from the water, its shape distorted by the ripples. At first, he thought it was a person, but as it stood to its full height, he realized how wrong he was. It was at least 8 feet tall, its skin dark and slick like wet bark. Its limbs were long and thin, ending in what looked like claws that scraped against the nearest tree trunk. Sam stumbled back, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The creature turned its head toward him. Its face, or what passed for a face, smooth and featureless except for 2 glowing pinpoints of light where its eyes should be. It stepped closer, the water barely rippling around its legs. Sam's survival instincts kicked in. He grabbed a burning stick from the fire and waved it in front of him, shouting, though he didn't know what he was trying to say. The creature stopped, its glowing eyes narrowing. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, with a sound like a low, guttural growl, it turned and disappeared into the trees. Sam didn't wait to see if it was coming back. He threw his gear into the kayak and pushed off into the water, paddling as fast as his arms would allow. The maze of trees felt endless, every shadow a potential threat. By the time he reached the main channel, his arms were trembling, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He didn't stop paddling until he saw the faint glow of the rental shop's dock lights in the distance. When he finally reached the shore, the old-timer was waiting, leaning against the dock with a cigarette dangling from his lips. "You're back early," the man said, his tone almost amused. Sam didn't answer. He pulled the kayak onto the dock and climbed out, his legs shaky beneath him. The man squinted at him through the smoke. "You saw it, didn't you?" Sam froze, his mind racing. He didn't want to believe what he'd seen, let alone talk about it. But the look in the old-timer's eyes told him he wasn't the first. "You stay out of the trees after dark," the man said again, this time with a knowing smile. Sam didn't respond. He got in his car and drove straight home, leaving the kayak, the campsite, and whatever waited in the shadows of Caddo Lake far behind. He never went back. Jenny wasn't an outdoorsy type, but when her boyfriend Mark convinced her to join him on a camping trip in Montana's Bitterroot Valley, she decided to humor him. She figured she'd take a couple of nice Instagram photos, drink some wine by the fire, and endure 2 nights in a tent for the sake of their relationship. Mark, on the other hand, was a die-hard nature enthusiast who insisted they hike into the less traveled areas of the valley. He promised her it would be quiet, scenic, and totally worth the effort. What he didn't tell her was that the area they were heading to, Deep Hollow, had a reputation as being off. It wasn't until they'd parked the truck at a remote trailhead that Jenny felt strange. She also noticed that there were no other cars, and the trail didn't look like it saw much use. "Are you sure this is a good spot?" she asked, adjusting her too heavy pack. "It's perfect," Mark replied with a grin. "No crowds, no noise, just us and nature." They started down the trail, and Jenny tried to focus on the beauty around her. The trees were massive, their trunks covered in moss, and the air smelled clean and earthy. But as they hiked deeper into the woods, the atmosphere changed. The usual forest sounds, birds, squirrels, the occasional rustle of a breeze, faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. Jenny pointed it out, but Mark shrugged it off. "It's just remote," he said. They reached a clearing by late afternoon and set up camp near a creek. Mark got a fire going, and for a while it was nice. They roasted hot dogs, shared a bottle of cheap wine, and laughed about how out of her element Jenny felt. Then the noises started. It was subtle at first, a distant crack, like a branch snapping under something heavy. Jenny stopped mid-laugh. "Did you hear that?" Mark looked toward the trees. "Probably just a deer," he said, but his voice wasn't as confident as before. The sound came again, closer this time. A deliberate crack, followed by a low guttural noise that Jenny couldn't identify. "That's not a deer," she said, her stomach nodding. Mark stood and grabbed the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the tree line. "It's fine," he said. "Probably just an elk or something." Jenny wasn't convinced, but she didn't want to seem paranoid. They stayed by the fire a little longer, trying to act normal, but both of them were on edge. When they finally climbed into the tent, Jenny lay awake, listening. Sometime in the middle of the night, she heard it again. A heavy footfall followed by another. Whatever it was big, and it was circling their campsite. "Mark," she whispered, shaking him awake. He groaned, but before he could say anything, they both heard it. A deep, rumbling grunt that sounded almost human. Mark sat up, his eyes wide. "Stay here," he whispered, grabbing the flashlight. "Are you crazy? Don't go out there." But he was already unzipping the tent. Jenny wanted to grab him to pull him back, but fear rooted her in place. Mark stepped outside, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. "Hello," he called, his voice trembling. "Anyone out there?" The only response was a long, low howl that made Jenny's blood run cold. It wasn't a wolf, and it wasn't a coyote. It was something else entirely. Mark stumbled back into the tent, his face pale. "We're leaving," he said. They packed in record time, shoving gear into their packs without bothering to organize it. As they started back down the trail, Jenny felt like they were being watched. Every so often, she'd hear a rustle behind them, or catch a glimpse of movement in her peripheral vision. But when she turned, nothing was there. "Are we sure we're going the right way?" she asked after what felt like hours. Mark checked the GPS. "It says we're on the trail." But the trees looked different, the underbrush thicker. The trail itself seemed narrower, almost overgrown. Jenny's heart sank. "This doesn't feel right." Mark didn't answer. He was too focused on the GPS, his brow furrowed. Then came the smell, rank and pungent, like rotting meat. Jenny gagged, covering her nose. "What is that?" Mark didn't have time to answer. From the trees ahead, a massive figure emerged. At first, Jenny thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but it was too tall, its arms too long. The creature was covered in matted hair, its face shadowed, but unmistakably ape-like. It stood there motionless, as if studying them. Mark slowly raised the flashlight, the beam shaking. The light caught the creature's eyes, which reflected an eerie red. "Run," he whispered. Jenny didn't need to be told twice. They bolted, crashing through the underbrush in the opposite direction. Behind them, they heard heavy footsteps, the sound of branches snapping as the creature gave chase. Jenny's lungs burned, her legs aching, but she didn't dare stop. Mark was ahead of her, shouting something she couldn't make out over the pounding in her ears. Then she tripped. She went down hard, her palms scraping against the rocky ground. She looked up just in time to see the creature emerge from the shadows. It towered over her, its breath visible in the cold night air. "Jenny!" Mark screamed, doubling back. But the creature didn't attack. It tilted its head, letting out a strange, almost mournful sound. For a moment, Jenny could have sworn it looked sad. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees. Mark helped her to her feet, and they didn't stop running until they reached the truck. They drove back to Missoula in silence, both too shaken to speak. Jenny didn't sleep for days after that. She replayed the encounter over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of it. She wanted to believe it was just a bear, but deep down, she knew better. Mark never mentioned going camping again, and Jenny didn't ask. Hey Donovan, I'm a contracted ROV or remotely operated vehicle operator in Louisiana. Specifically, I work the Atchafalaya Basin area, doing some inspection work around old pilings and submerged structures, usually for private construction outfits that need to check stability. My role basically involves piloting these underwater drones to take real-time footage, collect sonar data, and sometimes even grab small samples if a mechanical arm is attached. Most of the time it's pretty routine, just scanning for corrosion or damage to infrastructure. But occasionally we find odd bits of lost equipment or debris. The Atchafalaya, as you might know, is infamous for its murky waters and shifting silt. There's a constant movement of sediment because of how the Mississippi River interacts with the basin. Plus, every time we get a good rain or minor flood event, the water level changes dramatically, stirring everything up. I actually grew up near Morgan City, so I know the region like the back of my hand, at least on the surface. My dad used to take me out fishing on weekends, and we'd poke around these old cypress stands. Sometimes we'd even spot leftover relics from previous eras, like rusted out barges half buried in the mud. I kind of fell in love with the mystery of it all, which is how I ended up in this line of work. There's just something fascinating about exploring a world that most folks never get to see. Anyway, this happened in late September of last year, 2024. We had been hired by a local engineering firm to survey some sunken debris that was left over from an old ferry crossing that used to operate back in the 50s. If you dig into local history, you'll find these ferry routes that connected small communities across the basin before they built better bridges. You can still find remnants of the old loading ramps if you poke around enough. Twisted metal and chunks of concrete that poke up from the riverbank when the water is low. The engineering firm wanted to check the stability of what was left, presumably to decide whether it was safe to clear or if they'd just incorporate it into some new structure. That day, I was using a Deep Trekker DTG-3, which is a pretty standard underwater drone. It's shaped almost like a small sphere with a camera eye on the front. The camera can pan and tilt, and there's a built-in LED spotlight for low visibility. You've probably seen them in promotional videos. Folks use them for everything from aquaculture checks to search and rescue operations. They're good at maneuvering in tight spaces, which is crucial in an environment like the basin, where you can snag on tree roots or old wires if you're not careful. We'd been out on a skiff for about 3 hours, just running lanes back and forth, scanning the bottom with the sonar, and visually inspecting anything that looked man-made. The water was nasty as usual. Visibility only a couple of feet if you're lucky. And it's not just the mud or algae. It's a bit unnerving sometimes, because you never know if you're about to bump into a log or a gator. We actually lost a drone to a submerged snag last summer. It got tangled, and by the time we realized it, the electronics had shorted out. Ever since then, I've been more cautious, which means I spend more time on the sonar before I move in with the camera. During this particular job, the drone's sonar was picking up something unusual near a cluster of battered metal beams. At first, I assumed it was just an odd shape of rebar, or maybe a big fish passing by. We get big catfish and gar down there, and they can give surprising returns on the sonar if they're close enough. Still, something was off about the reading, so I panned the camera, controlled via a handheld station on deck, and tried to get a good look at it. That's when I saw what I initially thought was a diver. And let me tell you, that alone gave me a jolt. Nobody dives out there casually, not in that gross water, and certainly not without a lot of specialized gear. But the shape was off. It was roughly humanoid, but the head was disproportionately large compared to the body. I couldn't see any sort of breathing apparatus or typical diving gear. And the eyes, I'm calling them eyes, looked way too big and sunk in, like deep pits. It didn't look like any diver's mask I've ever come across, and I've worked with commercial divers who sport some pretty high-tech setups. This was something else entirely. I remember I let out this weird half-shout, half-gasp, loud enough to startle the gulls overhead. My co-worker, he was at the back of the skiff, holding the tether spool, called out wanting to know what was wrong. He must have thought the ROV got stuck or something, because I tend to get vocal if I see a big snag coming up on the camera feed. But I couldn't even form words for a second. I just stared at the monitor, trying to keep the drone's camera centered on what I was seeing. I think I waved at him to keep quiet or something like that. I barely remember. What really got me was how the shape turned toward the drone, like it actually registered that something was watching it. It's hard to describe, but I've controlled plenty of ROVs around fish, turtles, even the occasional curious alligator, and nothing behaves quite like that. If a fish sees the drone's light, it usually bolts immediately or just drifts away slowly. This thing paused. It looked directly at the camera lens. That's what it felt like anyway. And for a split second, I found myself holding my breath as if I was in the water with it. My coworker was still over my shoulder asking, "What is it? Do we have a problem?" And I couldn't even talk. I was too busy trying to keep the camera from drifting off target as the current shifted. Then it darted backward with this crazy speed and fluidity, like it was moving through open air instead of muddy water. I couldn't believe how smoothly it glided, totally unlike how a diver would push off. Even the best scuba divers, they sort of move in slow arcs when they change direction, especially if they're wearing gear. This was more like a large fish's quick burst, except bigger and more controlled. It looked borderline supernatural, to be honest. The water around it didn't even seem to stir as much as you'd expect. I've watched the footage again and again on my laptop at home. I wish I could say it's crystal clear, but the silt and low light made it tough to get a clean image. Still, there's enough detail to see a distinct humanoid figure, somewhere around average adult height. The head, though, it's undeniably bigger than what you'd expect on a person. I've tried comparing it to diving helmets online, looking up vintage gear or specialized commercial diving rigs. None of that matches the shape I recorded. And the eyes, well, they're huge. You see them as these dark spots that almost dominate the face. There's no sign of a tank strapped on its back. No hoses, no flippers. If some expert free diver was down there, they'd have to be off their rocker to do it in the Atchafalaya Basin, of all places. The water's filthy, currents can be unpredictable, and you've got all kinds of hazards from submerged logs to snags of old fishing line. Plus, the speed this figure showed is off the charts. The only living things I've seen move that quickly underwater are maybe gar or big catfish spooked by the ROV lights. But those are obviously fish shapes. This was human-shaped, or at least close to it. I've tried to rationalize it 1,000 different ways. Could it be a piece of debris that looked like a person when the water moved it around? Possibly, but debris doesn't turn and stare back at you. Could it be a big fish with a misshapen head, or some weird silhouette caused by the silt haze? Maybe, but that doesn't explain how clearly I saw those two dark pits where eyes should be. I even asked a friend of mine who used to run ROV missions for search and recovery teams out in Florida if he'd ever seen something remotely like this. He said the only time he's seen big eyes is on large eels, but those don't come anywhere close to a human figure, and definitely not in the Atchafalaya, as far as either of us know. My coworker finally strolled up and glanced over my shoulder at the screen while I was replaying the footage. He just kind of shook his head and mumbled that it was probably some big fish. He's one of those no-nonsense types who doesn't want to engage with anything unusual. But I've spent way more hours glued to these monitors. I can tell a rotting log from a living creature, and that was absolutely something alive. Another strange thing that happened, and I have the data logs to prove it. Right when I first got that visual, the drone's depth sensor and heading indicators went haywire. The compass reading started spinning like it couldn't lock onto a heading. The altimeter that tells me how far off the bottom I am kept jumping around, and I actually had to reboot the ROV station feed. Normally, I'd chalk that up to the usual interference you get in brackish water, or from metal objects on the riverbed. But the timing was too coincidental. As soon as that figure disappeared from the frame, everything went back to normal. I've had malfunctions before, but never in sync with seeing something so bizarre. Anyway, I don't know what to make of it, but I'm sure it wasn't just a shadow or a regular fish. There's something about how it seemed to be aware of the drone, like it had intelligence behind those big eyes. I'm still replaying it in my head, wondering if I should have tried to follow it. But I was honestly shaken up, and I didn't want to risk losing another drone if it dove into some tangle of debris. I might regret that now, but at the time I was focused on making sure we didn't end up explaining to the client why we had to cut another ROV loose. I've heard stories around St. Martin Parish about underwater lights and rumored submerged crafts, but, to be honest, I always chalked it up to old fishermen spinning yarns after a few drinks. My grandpa used to tell tales of glowing orbs beneath the water that would follow his boat for a while before disappearing. I never really bought into any of it. Figured it was either reflection from passing cars or some bioluminescent algae. But now, I'm wondering if there's more going on in these bayou waters than I realized. People still talk about weird sightings near Lake Fosse Point or along the swamp edges, but they usually dismiss it as gators scaring off bait fish or just the natural swamp gas flaring up at night. I keep coming back to those eyes, deep-set black eyes, like they were sucking in all the light around them. The only real reflection I caught on camera was minimal, just a faint glint, and it sent a chill through me. The closest I can compare it to, and I know this might sound dramatic, are photos I've seen of certain deep-sea creatures, like the gulper eel or hatchetfish. Those things have bizarre eyes adapted for the dark depths, but this was definitely shaped like a man. Maybe not exactly, a little elongated, especially in the head, but close enough to make me question everything I thought I knew about what lives in these waters. I'm telling you this, Donovan, because I'm not sure who else to tell without sounding like I'm off my rocker. I'm not angling for attention or trying to stir up controversy. If anything, I'd rather keep my name out of it entirely. But I've seen your YouTube channel, and I know you're open to these kinds of accounts. Maybe there's someone out there who's had a similar run-in and can corroborate what I witnessed. Could be a fisherman who spotted something swimming oddly near their boat, or another ROV operator who saw a glimpse of something they couldn't explain. My company, on the other hand, would likely prefer I keep quiet. They have official protocols for reporting damage or hazards, but there's no checkbox for unidentified underwater humanoid. I suspect they don't want folks thinking these waters are home to anything strange, since that could complicate permits or property development. I can almost hear them telling me to focus on the infrastructure assessments. That's corporate speak for mind your own business. Anyway, that's about all I can tell you, Donovan. If you know anyone who's had experiences with underwater humanoid sightings around Louisiana, especially out here in the Atchafalaya, I'd really love to hear about it. I've still got the raw footage tucked away on an external drive. It's grainy and silt-choked, but it shows something. Right now, I'm keeping it under wraps, partly because I don't want it getting into the wrong hands or being mocked online. But I can't unsee what I saw, and it's been on my mind every time I'm back out there. Hey Donovan, I've been following your YouTube channel for a while now, and I've gone back and forth on whether to send you this. Part of me still can't believe what I saw, and the other part just wants some validation that I'm not losing it. Anyway, I'm down in southern Florida, in the Big Cypress region. Lived here most of my life, so I'm used to seeing all sorts of wildlife. Gators, panthers, even the occasional black bear wanders through now and then. I've seen cottonmouths coiled up in the most unexpected places. Even found a Burmese python near my cousin's property a couple years ago. But what I saw a few weeks ago Just doesn't fit into any category I know, wild or invasive. First off, let me give you a bit of background. I'm in my early 40s, work as a mechanic on the weekdays, and on weekends I like to explore the back roads and old logging trails, especially in the Big Cypress National Preserve. It's sort of my way to unwind from the grind, you know? I'm not much into fishing, but I'll go out there with a camera or binoculars and just see what's moving around. My family's property backs right up to some swampland off State Road 29, closer to Everglades City. We've been here for generations. My grandma's old photo albums have these black and white pictures of the cypress trees before half the area was logged out decades ago. So I feel pretty rooted here, in a way that makes me think I've seen it all. I usually ride out at dawn on an ATV, or sometimes a swamp buggy if it's been raining and the ground's too soft. In this part of Florida, you never really know what the day has in store for you. One second it's sunny, the next you're in a downpour that floods the trails. I always keep an eye out for deer sign or hog tracks. Hogs get pretty destructive if you let them roam. It's something I learned from my late uncle. He was a bit of an old school swamp man. Said the best time to catch wildlife is right before the sun fully rises, when everything's still waking up. He used to joke that the animals are as groggy as we are in the morning, so you've got a better shot at spotting them. Anyway, this happened on a Sunday morning, maybe around 6:30 a.m. I remember it because it was shortly after that big cold snap we got this past winter. It was the kind of morning where the air was crisp enough that you could see a bit of your breath if you exhaled hard. For Florida, that's practically Arctic conditions. The upside was that the mosquitoes weren't out in full force yet, so I was enjoying the ride without slapping at my neck every other second. I was on this old logging road that winds back into the preserve, about 2 miles off the main path, maybe a little more if you count the detours around some flooded ditches. There's a particular spot I like to check because now and then you'll see fox squirrels running around in the early light. They're big and fluffy and have this bizarre curiosity about them. I've had them come right up to the buggy to see what I'm doing. I was hoping for a photo or two, so I slowed the ATV down to a crawl and started scanning the tree line with my binoculars. Just an old pair of Nikons I got from a pawn shop years ago. They're a bit scratched, but they get the job done. I spot something moving between the palmetto fronds, and my first thought is that it's a big gator sliding along the bank. That wouldn't be too unusual. Sometimes they shuffle around on land, especially if there's a slight rise where they can bask. But then I realize, no, gators don't usually stand upright. They sort of trundle on all fours, and you can tell by the shape of the body. This was something else entirely. At first, I assumed it might be a person, maybe a fellow hunter or someone scoping out the area. But the way it was hunched over looked odd. I lowered the binoculars and blinked, just to reset my eyes. That's when I noticed a long tail trailing behind it, and the color of its skin, or scales really, was this olive green with darker mottled patches across the back. The sun was just starting to cut through the cypress canopy, and in those beams of light, I could see a dull sheen that reminded me of the belly of a snake after it's shed its skin. Kind of glossy, but not wet. I've never seen anything quite like that texture on a living creature out here, and it gave me the chills. I mean, I'm used to handling tools in the shop, used to running into gators on the trails, but this was beyond normal. It was upright, 2 legs, hunched posture, a tail, and that strange coloration. I caught myself thinking, is this a trick of the light? Am I seeing a weird silhouette? But the more I stared, the more it just became obvious that this was something I couldn't easily explain away. To this day, every time I think back to that moment, I remember the specific way those palmetto fronds moved aside. It seemed like the creature was trying to remain hidden, like it knew enough to stay partially behind cover. The idea of an animal that's smart, an animal that's not supposed to exist, really rattled me. I've seen people claim all sorts of things in the Everglades. Florida panthers the size of small lions, skunk apes that vanish without a trace, you name it. But a reptilian walking on 2 legs with a tail, that was new territory for me. I was torn between wanting to step on the gas and get out of there or trying to edge closer for a better look. In the end, I just stayed put, binoculars pressed to my face, feeling my heart pounding. That's when it shifted its body, and I got a fleeting glimpse of what looked like a narrow, almost pointed snout, like a gator, but more tapered and raised higher up, if that makes sense. It didn't look bulky or slow. If anything, it looked agile and alert, almost like it was considering its options. Maybe it was deciding whether to run or come toward me. I think back to that moment every so often. If I had turned off the ATV's engine, would I have heard it breathing, or maybe even a hiss? Could I have snuck up for a better look? Probably not, but it's the kind of what if that keeps you awake at night. All I know is, after seeing that shape, that tail, that greenish skin, I was convinced there's something out here in Big Cypress that we're not fully aware of. You always say on your channel that there's more out there than we realize. And for the first time in my life, I wholeheartedly agree. I just sat there, heart hammering in my chest so loudly I could practically hear the blood rushing in my ears. The creature took a couple of slow, deliberate steps, and I kid you not, it looked entirely reptilian. I've seen iguanas the size of small dogs, and I've run into my share of monitor lizards in pet shops or reptile shows, but this was in a different league altogether. The head was elongated, coming to a pointed snout, with eyes set forward like a predator. For a split second, I thought maybe it was one of those exotic pets turned invasive. Florida's got a long track record of that sort of thing. I mean, Burmese pythons are practically a household name around here now. But the moment I took in the full size of it, at least 5 or 6 feet tall, maybe taller if it straightened up, I knew it wasn't any common species I'd ever heard of. Even a massive iguana doesn't come close to the build or stance this thing had. I must have gasped or made some involuntary noise, because my dog, she's an old yellow lab mix, sitting right beside me on the ATV passenger seat, started whining like she does when she senses I'm spooked. I remember mentally kicking myself, thinking, if I spook this thing, what happens next? Do I floor it and risk it giving chase? My hands were shaking so badly that when I tried to get my phone out, it slipped right through my fingers and landed on the ATV floorboards. By the time I snatched it back up and looked at the palmettos again, the creature had clearly noticed me. You could sense the shift in its posture, the way it angled its head, like it was weighing its options. I couldn't see its mouth fully, but I swear there was a glint that looked like teeth when it turned. Might have just been the shape of the jaw, or a trick of the light catching the scales. But at that moment, it felt downright menacing. The entire encounter probably lasted no more than 5 or 6 seconds, but it stretched out in my mind like one of those slow-motion movie scenes. A big part of me wanted to reach over for my rifle, there in the ATV rack for hog control, but I was too paralyzed with fear to even move my arm. My dog was whining and pacing on the seat, ears flattened against her head. I've faced down plenty of wild critters before, but something in my gut told me this was on another level. The creature stared right at me. At least that's how it felt. You know that feeling you get when you catch a person's eyes across a room and realize they're focused on you? Multiply that by 100, and you might get close to the intensity I felt. And then, in an instant, it bolted. It slipped into the thick brush like it had been living in that tangle of roots and cypress knees its whole life, which, for all I know, it might have. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, crashing through the undergrowth with a speed and agility I'd expect from a panther or a deer, not a bulky reptile. I just sat there stunned, wondering if it would circle back around. My dog started barking, which finally snapped me out of my stupor. That's when I decided maybe it was time to leave well enough alone. On the ride back, I kept replaying it over and over in my head. Could it have been a skunk ape? Folks around here swear they see them, but that's always described as a hairy primate, more like a Bigfoot. This thing, fully reptilian, down to the scaly texture I caught on its limbs. I tried telling my cousin, without sounding like I'd lost it, that I'd seen a big weird lizard out there. He brushed it off, said it was probably just another invasive iguana. Reminded me how iguanas freeze and drop from trees when it gets cold near Miami. But we're not in Miami, and anyway, iguanas don't walk around on 2 legs like that. Certainly not at that size. No matter what I do, I can't shake the image of that silhouette lurking among the palmettos. The smooth way it moved, how it carried its body, it just felt unnatural for any animal I know. Sure, I've seen those little Jesus lizards, basilisk lizards, run on 2 legs, but they're tiny and more comical than threatening. This thing was all business. The strangest part, though, was the sense that it was observing me too. When I lock eyes with a bear or even a panther, I can sense a baseline curiosity or a territorial vibe. This felt different, like there was an intelligence behind those eyes. It was as if it was evaluating me, trying to decide if I was a threat or maybe something else. That thought alone has kept me up at night more than I'd like to admit. I mentioned it to one more person, a buddy of mine who used to work for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and his reaction was about what you'd expect. He shrugged it off, said something about large monitor lizards or possibly a Nile monitor, because those do show up in Southwest Florida from time to time. People get them as pets and then can't handle them once they reach 4 or 5 feet. But in my head, I kept thinking, sure, maybe a Nile monitor. But does a Nile monitor really walk around on 2 legs at that height? It just doesn't fit. Still, I tried to keep an open mind. You never know with all the weird invasive species we've got here. I ended up poking around on the internet, late at night, half convinced I'd find some rational explanation. There were a few older posts on fringe forums about a so-called lizard man, or reptilian humanoid near the Everglades. But those threads mostly devolved into conspiracy theories about secret government experiments or leftover creatures from some prehistoric era. I couldn't tell what was credible and what was just wild speculation. Yet, a part of me couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that I wasn't the first person to see something like this. Ever since that day, I've been way more cautious about going out to the deeper parts of the preserve alone. And let me tell you, it takes a lot to spook me. I grew up around these swamps, and I've dealt with more than my share of gators and snakes. But there's a difference between an animal I know and something that doesn't fit into any category I'm aware of. I still go, though, because that land is in my blood. I can't just stay away. A few times I've heard rustling behind me, or maybe caught a glimpse of something ducking behind palmettos or cypress trunks. Usually it's nothing. Raccoons, armadillos, that sort of thing. But every now and then, my stomach does a flip-flop like I'm being watched. Makes me wonder if there really is more than one of these things out there, or if it's the same one roaming around, staying just out of sight. And that's the question that keeps gnawing at me. If that reptilian creature is really out there, did it wander up from the depths of the Everglades? Have they been here longer than we realize, just hiding in the thickest parts of the swamp? Part of me wants to strap on a GoPro and do a full-scale search, but another part is worried about what I might find, or what might find me. I keep picturing those big yellow eyes locked onto mine, that flash of teeth or jaw. I'm not looking for trouble, trust me on that. Anyway, I know I've gone on long enough, but I wanted to tell someone who wouldn't automatically label me as crazy. Your channels help me realize there are other people out there who've seen bizarre things, and they're just as confused and curious as I am. If you or anyone in your community has any insight, like, oh yeah, I saw something like that in Big Cypress too, I'd love to hear it. I'm not saying I want to gather a posse and hunt it down. I just want some kind of explanation, something that might make sense of what I encountered. Donovan, I'm typing this out in the middle of the night because I just can't shake what's been happening along the border down here in the Tucson sector. And I figured you might want to put this on your YouTube channel if you think folks would be interested. I've been with the US Border Patrol for more years than I care to count, and I've seen some strange stuff. But lately, things have gone from, that's odd, to, I'm not even sure I can trust my own eyes. Still, I feel like I need to document it, get it off my chest, and let someone outside the agency know what's been transpiring. I've been stationed near the Sasabe, Arizona crossing for a while now. Lots of desert, rolling hills, and a harsh environment that usually does a good job deterring most folks. Under normal conditions, you deal with your standard mix of narcotics smuggling, folks seeking a better life, maybe a few coyote-run groups trying to sneak over during the night. It used to be that we'd come across footprints, empty water jugs, maybe the occasional piece of clothing snagged on the barbed wire. Then you'd follow the trail and either apprehend the group or they'd slip away into the brush. But times have changed. With the prior Trump administration's emphasis on border enforcement, we got new gear, more manpower, bigger budgets, and we got new segments of what people call the wall. It's not the old fence I remember when I first started. These are taller steel bollards, rebar laced, nearly 30 feet in some areas with anti-climb plates near the top. It's designed so your average person can't easily scale it, and it's definitely not something you can just toss a ladder onto and hoist yourself over, at least not in most places. I mean, I've been personally present when people have tried and ended up breaking limbs dropping from the top. It's no joke. But in the last year, we started getting reports of intruders that didn't fit the usual profile. You might scoff at that phrase, but that's exactly what we call them. Intruders, or UDA, undocumented alien, if you're going by standard Border Patrol lingo. But these intruders, I'm not sure they're humans in the typical sense. And before you assume I've lost it, understand I'm not the only one out here who's seen them. The reason I'm up half the night writing this is because I just got back from a shift that was almost too bizarre to put into words, but I'm going to try. I can't guarantee a nice, linear account, because my mind's all over the place. But here goes. It started maybe 6 months ago, around midsummer of last year, when we got one of those calls that always sets your adrenaline spiking. One of the remote sensors triggered near Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument, and that patch of desert is tricky. It's wide open in some places, but the terrain can be rocky with a lot of cactus, and the summer heat is brutal. Typically, we'd race out, expecting to maybe find a group that had tripped the sensor. Instead, we show up to find these bizarre footprints in the sandy wash. They were elongated, almost like a foot that was too narrow and had an odd curvature. And the spacing between prints suggested something with a stride longer than any normal human. We do get folks who are extremely tall, but this was different. Each step was maybe 5 or 6 feet from the other, and there were no drag marks, no scuffs, none of the usual signs that come with crossing. Just these crisp, spaced-out prints going straight to the fence. And at the base of the fence, the footprints just stopped. Now, I'm used to seeing scuff marks where people climb, especially if they're wearing standard shoes or boots. You'll find friction marks on the steel, maybe some cloth or rubber embedded if they're wearing cheap footwear. But this time, we found no sign of climbing gear, no smudges, nothing. It was like whoever, or whatever it was, just leapt over in one go. My partner that night joked maybe it was a kangaroo, which of course makes no sense, but it was about the only rational comparison. We reported what we found, filed it away, and the official line was that it was probably an anomaly, a smuggler with some specialized contraption, or a coyote with a ladder that he took back over with him. But none of that matched what we saw. Also, we never found corresponding footprints on the other side of the fence where they would have landed, just vanished. I tried not to dwell on it too much. You see so many weird things out here. But then it started happening more often. The same type of footprints, sometimes near Lukeville, sometimes further east near Nogales. No sign of forced entry, or I guess forced climb, just tracks that would appear and vanish around the border barrier. And if it was one of those nights with a bright moon, you sometimes felt like someone was watching you from the other side, or even from up in the hills. I can't tell you how many times I'd do a 360, shining my flashlight around, convinced I'd heard something, or that I'd caught a silhouette of something on a ridgeline. But I'd see nothing but the outlines of cacti and the desert brush. One night, I remember it was close to 2 a.m. We were on the lookout near the San Miguel Gate area. The sensor had gone off again, and we were watching from our unit, engine and lights off, to maintain the element of surprise. Over the radio, one of our guys said in a hushed tone that he could see movement on thermal. So I flicked on our vehicle's FLIR screen, the forward-looking infrared, to see if I could spot what he was talking about. Sure enough, there was a heat signature, a big one, pacing along the fence line. My first thought was, it had to be more than one person, maybe a group huddled together. But as I watched, It appeared to be a single figure, or shape, with this weird stooped posture. We're all used to seeing normal body shapes through thermal. You see the head, shoulders, arms, torso, legs. This was different. Tall, but the head and upper body were hunched forward, elongated, almost serpentine in a way. It moved in a fluid manner that didn't look anything like a person trying to be stealthy or run. It just glided along, occasionally dropping to all fours, but then standing back up again. I called it in on the radio, and while we debated whether to approach or keep watching, the thing effortlessly scaled the fence in the thermal display. When I say effortlessly, I'm not exaggerating. It kind of compressed itself, bunched up, and then soared over the top without even pausing. You'd expect some flailing or a moment of balancing, but there was none of that. It vanished from the screen, and the next second, we lost the heat signature entirely. We ran over to the fence line and found the exact same elongated footprints. One of the younger guys, who's from a ranching family, said it reminded him of how a mountain lion leaves tracks, except for the fact these had a distinct heel and shape resembling a foot. The entire vibe was something I'd call wrong, if that makes sense. An intangible sense that we weren't dealing with a normal crossing. We filed that report, and the official story was that it might have been a person using advanced climbing gear or something else. But among ourselves, we started talking about legends, especially those from around these parts. Some guys mentioned skinwalkers, others said shapeshifters, some said the chupacabra. We have a lot of southwestern folklore. I'm not one to jump to the supernatural, but the more of these nighttime sightings I saw or heard about from my partners, the less I could brush it off as just a fluke. Around that same time, we started noticing strange lights in the sky as well. That might sound completely unrelated, but down here, UFO sightings are not uncommon. You talk to enough ranchers, you'll hear about lights that dance around in the desert, sometimes near the ground, sometimes high up in the sky. I thought I had seen it all, but one night, I was parked near a remote road, scanning the horizon, and in the distance, I caught a flash of greenish light that zipped by horizontally and then shot straight up. I radioed in, but no one else had eyes on it. Then, about a minute later, a second, smaller orb-like light seemed to appear from nowhere, flutter around near the top of the fence and vanish. Honestly, I've never seen anything quite like it. They looked almost like glowing tennis balls bouncing around in the darkness, if you can picture that. Again, no explanation. That same shift, we found more of those elongated tracks. As you know, with the push to build more walls under President Trump's administration, everything got heavily politicized, so it was, and still is, a tense environment. We're under pressure to produce results, catch people, reduce crossings. There's drones overhead, new sensor arrays, better night vision, the works. But despite all that fancy tech, these creatures, or whatever they are, never register the way normal people do. We rarely catch them on camera, and when we do, it's inconclusive. The images come out distorted, or the figure moves so fast you only get a blur. And for all the times we get them on thermal, we can't seem to get close enough to intercept. They either vanish into the desert or scale the fence before we can arrive. I remember a conversation with one of our older guys who's nearing retirement. He said that back in the 90s, before all this advanced enforcement, there were rumors of certain spots along the border known for weird sightings. He claimed that near Yuma, guys used to swear they saw tall, hairless beings that could run 60 or 70 miles per hour across the desert, outrunning any vehicle or helicopter. Everyone dismissed it as tall tales or confusion with drug mules using advanced smuggling techniques. But now he sees the same details cropping up in our new reports. It's as if whatever that phenomenon was, it's ramping up again. We have no official briefing on it. It's all hush-hush. But talk to the right colleagues over a few beers, and the stories come spilling out. In early December, there was an incident that rattled me. We got a tip about a group crossing near the Babokavari Peak area, which is notoriously rugged. A group of us agents responded, thinking we might be dealing with a big load of narcotics or a coyote operation. We split up, scanning with night vision goggles and flashlights. I was with two other guys. We found what looked like a makeshift campsite. Still smoldering embers, scattered blankets, water jugs, but no people. The weird thing was, the perimeter of this campsite had footprints, those same elongated prints, but there were multiple sets this time, like 3 or 4 different individuals, all with that same bizarre shape. The spacing of each footstep told us they stood at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. One of the guys pointed out that some of the footprints looked like they overlapped in odd ways, almost like they were pacing in circles around the campsite. It was an unsettling sight, I'll tell you that. We called for backup, and by the time the other agents arrived, half the footprints seemed to have been wiped away by some method. The wind wasn't blowing nearly enough to cover them with sand that quickly. It was as if something or someone deliberately erased them. Now, I'm not going to name names, but a couple of the guys, including myself, started speculating about government or military involvement. You know how rumors spread. We wondered if maybe these were some sort of experimental troops or test subjects. Sounds insane, I know, but sometimes you hear about black projects, human-animal hybrids, or genetically modified soldiers. It's the stuff of tabloids, but when you see these prints vanish or see the fence scaled in seconds, you start questioning the boundaries of what's possible. And if these creatures are crossing back and forth, it's almost as if they're testing the border. We don't see any contraband left behind, no sign of a typical smuggling route. They appear, then disappear. I used to be big into southwestern legends and read about the Tohono O'odham people's stories. They talk about spirits in the desert, shape changers and watchers. I never gave it much thought beyond local lore, but some of it resonates with what we're encountering. My buddy who's half Navajo even mentioned the possibility of skinwalkers. Those are witches that can transform into animals or other shapes. Typically, it's linked with more malevolent entities, able to run on all fours at insane speeds, or even slip through cracks in rock walls. It was always more of a horror story to me, something you'd talk about around a campfire. But in the last few months, I've been less skeptical. I don't know if that's what we're dealing with, but it sure ain't normal folks wandering across. Remember that period in 2018 when the news kept talking about migrant caravans and how the administration was cracking down, sending the National Guard to help us out? Well, ironically, that's around the time some of the weirdness really picked up. It's almost like the more we militarized the border, the more these sightings occurred. One explanation a buddy suggested is that the underground smuggling community might have turned to new tactics, including high-tech suits or exoskeletons, or even paying off folks with advanced climbing capabilities. But that does not explain the footprint's shape, the bizarre behavior, the times we've tried to chase them and they vanish into thin air. We do have dogs too. We track with K9 units. On multiple occasions, the dogs refuse to follow certain trails. They'd whimper, get anxious, try to back away. That's not normal, especially for a well-trained Belgian Malinois or German Shepherd that's used to chasing down criminals in the dead of night. Something about these trails freaked them out. Anyway, fast forward to last week. We had a relatively quiet shift. I was patrolling near the 3 Points area. The radio was silent, so I stepped out to stretch my legs. The desert was eerily calm. No wind, no rustling from rodents or anything. That's when I noticed, under the faint moonlight, a silhouette standing maybe 200 yards from me on the other side of the highway. At first, I thought it was a saguaro cactus trunk. You know how they can appear like a person in low light. But then it moved. It took a step or two toward me, paused, and seemed to tilt its head like it was studying me. The shape was tall, gaunt, with limbs that looked too elongated. I slowly reached for my flashlight, trying not to spook it. I flicked it on, and in that split second of illumination, I swear I saw reflective eyes, like an animal's eye shine, except set forward in the face like a human. Then, quick as you like, it darted away at a speed I've never seen a person replicate. It crossed that open ground, scaled a barbed wire fence, and disappeared into the desert before my flashlight beam could follow. I stood there, heart hammering, realizing that was definitely one of the creatures. I checked for footprints, and yes, I found 2 of those elongated tracks in the dirt. Called in the sighting, but by the time a partner arrived, there was no trace left. Then last night's shift was the kicker. Why I'm writing this right now. We got a call around midnight about movement near the border fence just west of Nogales. Another sensor went off, and we assumed it was your standard crossing. We mobilized 4 units, each approaching from different angles, trying to box them in. As we converged, I caught a glimpse of at least 2 figures on my night vision. They were hunched, tall, and moving with a weird gait that alternated between upright and all fours. One agent approached with caution, announcing themselves in Spanish, the usual routine. No response. Then we heard this guttural hiss. Not a growl, not a language, but like a hiss you'd hear from a big lizard or snake. The agent freaked out and shouted for them to stop, to show their hands. The figures turned and scaled the fence. One hopped up so fast it was like it had springs for legs, and the other moved horizontally along the fence at an impossible angle, then propelled itself up and over. No gear, no climbing hooks, nothing. One of our guys fired a less lethal round, a pepper ball, out of pure panic, but the creatures were gone in an instant. We approached the spot where they'd been. The ground there is pretty hard packed, so footprints weren't as defined. Still, we found a partial print with that elongated shape. The entire team was rattled. Over the radio, someone said, "They're not human," which sparked a mini panic, as we all realized we had no idea what we just encountered. We stuck around, did a grid search for about an hour, found nothing except some weird scratch marks on the steel fence. We've tested that fence with standard climbing attempts, and typically you see scuffs from boots or gloves. These marks looked more like claw indentations. Everyone was quiet on the drive back. No one quite knows how to handle a situation like that. That's the story so far, though story might be the wrong word because it's ongoing. And the more it happens, the less I feel in control. We've tried sending the relevant details up the chain of command, but we get the same old, just keep patrolling, keep documenting. They're not giving us any official guidance on how to deal with these sightings. Some folks suspect there might be hush-hush directives from higher up. Maybe we're told to keep it under wraps so it doesn't cause a public stir. After all, the border is a hot-button issue, and can you imagine the reaction if the public found out about, well, entities that don't seem to be normal humans crossing back and forth at will? There's a rumor that in the El Paso sector, a few agents had a face-to-face encounter with something reptilian. That's the word they used, reptilian. They said it had a scaled appearance, big black eyes, and it was clinging to the wall about 15 feet up when they spotted it with a spotlight. By the time they scrambled out of their vehicles, it was at the top and gone. I didn't witness that personally, but I trust the agent who told me. He's not the type to spin tall tales. And apparently, when they reported it, they got a real stern talk from higher-ups, basically telling them to keep quiet. One guy let it slip that ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, might have special instructions about these sightings, but is reluctant to share. Another mentioned that the military presence in certain border zones isn't just about supporting the border mission. It's about monitoring these anomalies. Again, that's all secondhand, so I can't confirm. Sometimes when I'm driving alone at night along the remote roads between these little border towns, I let my imagination get the better of me, and I think about all the UFO talk, the stories about reptilians living in subterranean bases, or the accounts of Bigfoot-like creatures migrating through desert washes. I used to dismiss that as pure speculation, but now, every time I hear a weird noise or see something flicker across my peripheral vision, I question everything. On the nights I do see something, it's so fleeting that I can't get solid proof. It's mentally exhausting, like being stuck in the twilight zone. You wonder how many other people have had similar experiences and just kept quiet so they don't sound nuts. I talked to a local rancher near Aravaca who claims that for decades he's had nighttime visitors that he calls the Watchers. He said they're tall, lean figures that slip across his property without disturbing the livestock. Sometimes, though, the cattle would get spooked and wouldn't produce milk for a day or two. He claims to have found half-eaten coyotes on his land, as if something was hunting them. The rancher says he doesn't bother reporting it to us because he doesn't think we'll believe him. But he swears these watchers are not normal humans, and he claims to have seen them leap over a 10-foot fence with minimal effort. This is the same region we're seeing the elongated footprints in. Coincidence? I'm starting to doubt it. So, all of this begs the question, are these sightings new, or have they been going on forever, and we're just now noticing because security is so tight? Maybe these entities have always roamed the desert under the cover of darkness, and it's only with the new sensors, drones, and the bigger presence of border agents that we're catching glimpses of them. I don't have the answer. We share these stories quietly among ourselves, but no one's stepping forward publicly because the chain of command is very strict about no speculation in official reports. If we do mention something out of the ordinary, we get told to revise or omit certain details. I recall a conversation with an agent who transferred from the Laredo sector. He said back in 2019, a small group of agents encountered a massive winged creature near the Rio Grande. He described it as a Mothman-like figure, with a wingspan nearly 15 feet across, perched on the top of a tree near the riverbank. They tried shining lights on it, but it flew off, disappearing into the darkness. The official explanation was a big vulture or a large hawk that was misidentified, but those guys swore it looked humanoid and had glowing red eyes. They were so spooked they refused to patrol that area alone for a while. Stories like that don't usually make it outside of our immediate circles, but I believe there's a pattern forming across the entire southern border. Another weird phenomenon, missing time. I personally have not experienced it, but two agents I trust told me about an incident near the Tohono-O'odham reservation line. They were in their vehicle, scanning for movement, and the next thing they knew, 2 hours had passed. Neither of them recalled falling asleep or blacking out, but their dash cam showed them sitting motionless for that entire time. The only weird detail on the footage was a bright flash of light that occurred about half an hour into this missing time. The official stance was they must have dozed off from exhaustion, but they swear up and down that's not what happened. And on top of everything else, we sometimes get that sense of being watched from above, like there's a presence that's aware of our movements. Could be paranoia, sure, but so many of us share the same feeling. The desert nights can be eerie, no doubt, but this is different. It's beyond the typical desert spookiness. I wonder if there's some kind of government or military cover-up. We get these borderline encounters, we gather data, and it disappears up the chain. Maybe the higher-ups are logging it, analyzing it, but sure aren't telling us anything. We're just the boots on the ground, told to keep searching for normal crossers and contraband, while ignoring the truly unexplainable. It's frustrating because you're left to rationalize bizarre experiences on your own, which eventually wears you down. I'm telling you all this, Donovan, because I know you keep an open mind. Personally, I don't care if I get ridiculed. Something is happening out here, and it needs more attention. I can't keep quiet, especially when younger agents are getting spooked. Or worse, they're seeing these things and thinking they're going crazy. They're not crazy. It's real, and it's not isolated to one stretch of border. I've heard similar stories from agents near the Big Bend sector, from folks in the El Centro sector, and even some near Brownsville. The details might vary: a weird shape, strange footprints, silhouettes scaling the fence, but the gist is the same. I don't think these entities are crossing for the same reasons normal migrants do. They don't seem to carry supplies. They're not smuggling. They show up, they vanish. Sometimes they're seen alone, other times in small groups. Could be something interdimensional, as wild as that sounds. Could be some advanced species using the remote desert as a testing ground. Could be military black ops. I've asked myself 100 times, why the border specifically? Maybe they're studying our response times. Or maybe the border barrier is like a challenge or a boundary line they want to cross, for reasons we can't fathom. Or maybe it has nothing to do with politics or immigration. Maybe it's just a geographic location that suits them. We have enough anecdotal evidence to fill a book. Sightings in the desert, glowing lights, creatures with unnatural climbing abilities, footprints that defy logic. But we don't have definitive proof. No clear photos, no confirmed videos. I've tried capturing cell phone footage, but it's always too dark, too far away, or the creatures move too fast. The only semi-decent footage we got was from a handheld thermal scope, but it's so grainy that it's inconclusive. People would say it's a trick of the light or a glitch. Let me wrap up, though wrap up is a misnomer because this is far from over. The official stance is nothing to see here. The unofficial stance from us guys on the ground is something big is going on, and we're being kept in the dark. We just keep quiet, keep patrolling. I don't know what to expect in the coming months. A part of me worries we might have a more dramatic confrontation soon. What if these entities start getting aggressive? Or what if they already are, and we just haven't seen the worst of it? Some nights I half expect to find one of my fellow agents gone missing. The only reason that might not be happening is because the creatures don't want to be revealed. I get goosebumps thinking about it. Anyway, Donovan, that's my long-winded account of what's been going on. Feel free to share it on your channel in whatever format you choose. People might dismiss it, but at least the story is out there. If you get other folks who have seen similar things, let me know. I'd like to compare notes, see if there's a pattern across different regions. Because right now, all I have are pieces of a puzzle, and I'm sure there are more pieces out there.